Between January and November of 2023, 17 separate recordings captured what appears to be the same humanoid entity moving through a specific stretch of shallow water in the Florida Keys. The footage, shot by tourists, fishing guides, and night divers who had no contact with each other, shows a figure that moves too quickly to be human and with too much purpose to be any known marine animal. But the recordings themselves aren't what makes this investigation unusual. It's what happened when those who filmed it tried to talk about it with locals. The entity appears most frequently in a zone that residents refer to, only when pressed, as the Dead Channel. It's not a name you'll find on navigation charts or tourism maps. No official designation exists for this stretch of water running between the mangroves, roughly 3 miles northeast of Duck Key. But every longtime captain knows it, and every longtime captain will navigate around it after sunset without offering explanation. I'm presenting this investigation as a documentary journalist who has spent 4 months attempting to interview residents, charter operators, and commercial fishermen in the Keys about these recordings. What I discovered wasn't a community frightened by what lives in their water. It was a community that has deliberately maintained silence about it for generations, and that silence appears to be fracturing under the weight of smartphone cameras and social media exposure. The footage I'm about to show you has been verified as unedited by 3 separate digital forensics analysts. The metadata confirms the dates, times, and GPS coordinates. What you're looking at was filmed in water shallow enough to stand in, less than 4 miles from a major highway in one of the most heavily touristed regions of the United States. This is the clearest clip. It was recorded on March 14, 2023, at 6:47 p.m. by a tourist from Ohio who was paddleboarding near mangrove roots at low tide. She had her GoPro mounted on a head strap, filming continuously as she navigated through what she described as a really peaceful channel between the trees. The camera captures her paddle entering the frame rhythmically, the golden hour light diffusing through the canopy, the shallow water so clear you can see individual stones on the bottom. At timestamp 4:12, something moves in the left periphery of the frame. It's not a fish. The shape is vertical, not horizontal. It rises partially out of the water between 2 mangrove trunks, roughly 15 feet from the camera, holds position for approximately 2 seconds, then drops below the surface and moves right to left across the frame at a speed that seems physically wrong for the depth. The water there is roughly 4 feet deep. A human would need to crawl or crouch to move through it. This moves upright, fast, with a fluid gait that looks bipedal, but creates almost no visible wake. The woman on the paddleboard doesn't react immediately. She doesn't see it in the moment. The shape passes behind her and disappears into deeper shadow under the mangrove overhang. It's only when she reviewed the footage 2 hours later that she understood what the camera had captured. She posted the video to a Florida Keys community Facebook group at 9:33 p.m. that same night, asking if anyone knew what kind of animal this might be. The post received 4 comments in 6 minutes. 3 of them said simply, "Manatee." The 4th said, "Delete this." By midnight, the original poster said her video had been removed by Facebook for violating community standards, though she received no specific explanation. She attempted to re-upload it. The second post was removed within 20 minutes. I contacted her in August 2023. She still has the original file and has since made it private, sharing it only with researchers and journalists who reach out. She also told me something that establishes a pattern I would encounter repeatedly throughout this investigation. The day after she posted the video, she received a direct message from someone with a Keys area code. The message didn't introduce itself or explain how the sender had gotten her contact information before the post was deleted. It said only, "That channel floods at high tide, very dangerous for paddleboarding. You should stay in the marked routes." The warning wasn't threatening, it was almost polite, but she described feeling immediately uncomfortable, not because of what was said, but Because of what was implied, that someone local had seen what she filmed, knew where she had been, and wanted her to understand she'd gone somewhere she wasn't supposed to go. I began mapping the sightings in April 2023 after a charter captain in Marathon forwarded me 3 separate videos his clients had filmed over the previous 2 years. He did so anonymously, using a burner email account, and included no message except the files themselves and a single sentence. They all saw it in the same place. When I cross-referenced metadata from those videos with 8 other clips I'd collected from independent sources, the geographic clustering was undeniable. Every single recording was made within a zone measuring roughly 2 miles long and a quarter mile wide. The zone begins where a deep channel cuts unexpectedly through a shallow flat and ends where the mangroves thicken into a nearly impenetrable system that locals call the maze. Tides move through it strangely. On nautical charts, the area is marked with minimal detail, just depth soundings and a few sparse notations about submerged routes. I drove to Duck Key in May and attempted to hire a guide to take me into the dead channel. I did not use that name. I simply showed the coordinates and asked if anyone could bring me there to film a diving documentary. The first captain I approached looked at the GPS point on my phone, handed it back, and said, "Don't know it." I clarified that I was willing to pay above standard rates. He repeated, "Don't know it." The second captain studied the location longer, then asked where I'd heard about it. I told him I was researching unusual marine sightings. His expression didn't change, but his tone did. "There's nothing out there worth filming," he said. "Water's too skinny and the mangroves are too tight. You'd tear up your gear." I pointed out that the depth charts showed areas of 8 to 12 feet. He shrugged. "Charts are wrong a lot out here." The third captain was older, maybe mid-60s, with the kind of sun-damaged skin that comes from a lifetime on the water. When I showed him the coordinates, he set my phone down on the dock railing and looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You doing a documentary about what exactly?" I told him I was investigating reports of unidentified marine animals. "What reports?" I mentioned the footage, keeping my description vague. He nodded slowly, picked up my phone, and zoomed in on the map, studying it closely, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he handed it back and said, "I'll tell you the same thing I tell every other person who comes down here with a camera and a theory. The ocean's a big place. Lots of things live in it we don't understand. And the things that don't want to be understood usually have a good reason." I asked if that meant he'd seen something himself. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "It means you're not going to find a captain in the Keys who'll take you into water you've got no business being in." I asked what made it dangerous. "Didn't say it was dangerous," he replied. "Said you've got no business being in it." That conversation was the first time I began to understand that the locals' refusal to cooperate wasn't rooted in skepticism or fear. It was something closer to resolve. Whatever they knew, they had decided long ago not to share it, and no amount of money or persuasion was going to change that. The Dead Channel doesn't appear on any tourist map, and you won't find the name in official navigation databases or Coast Guard records. It exists only as local knowledge, passed between captains and fishing families, a designation that comes up in conversation rarely and only among people who've spent years in these waters. When I finally got someone to admit the name on record, he made me turn off my recorder first. Then he said it once, slowly, as if testing whether I already knew, the Dead Channel. When I asked why it was called that, he shook his head. "Just is." I filed public records requests with Monroe County for any incident reports, rescue calls, or navigation hazards associated with the coordinates. The response I received listed 2 minor boating accidents between 2015 and 2023, both described as propeller damage from submerged routes, and 1 water rescue in 2019 involving a kayaker who had become disoriented in the mangroves and called 911 after drifting for 3 hours. None of the reports mentioned anything unusual. No disappearances, no fatalities, no distress calls describing unknown animals or entities. On paper, the dead channel is unremarkable, but the pattern of avoidance is not. I spent 2 weeks reviewing maritime traffic data using AIS transponder records, which track the movement of registered vessels in near real time. The data shows boats passing on either side of the dead channel throughout the day, following routes to and from popular diving sites, fishing zones, and mangrove channels used for eco-tours. But after sunset, the traffic changes. Vessels that spent the afternoon moving freely through the surrounding areas begin navigating around the dead channel, creating a visible gap in their routes. The detour is slight, only a quarter mile at most, but it's consistent. I observed it across hundreds of log trips from dozens of different boats. I asked a commercial fisherman in Islamorada if he could explain the traffic pattern. He looked at the data on my laptop for less than 10 seconds before closing the screen. "That's just how people run," he said. "Mangroves are tight in there. You don't want to be messing with that in the dark." I pointed out that boats were running through similarly dense mangrove systems all along the Keys after dark without issue. "Then maybe those guys know something you don't," he said. The most detailed description of the dead channel's geography came not from a local, but from a hydrologist I hired to analyze the bathymetry and tidal flow. Using sonar data and satellite imaging, she mapped the channel as a narrow corridor where an unexpectedly deep trench, reaching 18 feet in some sections, cuts through otherwise shallow flats. The depth creates unusual tidal currents. Water flows in and out of the channel faster than the surrounding areas, which she explained could theoretically create temporary isolation during certain tidal windows. For roughly 2 hours during the transition from high to low tide, the channel holds water while the surrounding flats drain, forming what she described as a kind of seasonal pool system. The mangroves in that area are old-growth red mangroves, dense enough that satellite photos show them as an almost unbroken canopy. Their roots extend deep into the water, creating a 3-dimensional labyrinth that makes navigation difficult even in ideal conditions. Visibility below the surface is poor. The tannins leached from decaying vegetation stain the water dark amber. Even at midday, anything more than 6 feet below the surface becomes difficult to see clearly. When I asked the hydrologist if this environment could support a large, undocumented animal, she paused before answering. "Define large." I said something human-sized or larger. She considered that. The depth is there, the structure is there. Prey availability would depend on what it eats, but there's fish, crustaceans, mollusks, plenty of biomass. Concealment is near perfect. If something wanted to avoid detection, this is the kind of place it could do it. She hesitated, then added, "But we're talking about one of the most heavily studied coastlines in North America. The odds of an unknown mammal or large reptile persisting here undetected are effectively zero." I asked what she meant by effectively. "I mean that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence," she said, "but you'd need a compelling reason to believe something that improbable." The footage provides that reason. 17 separate recordings exist. I've verified each one through direct contact with the person who filmed it, confirmation of metadata, and in some cases, forensic analysis to rule out editing or digital manipulation. The recordings span from June 2021 to November 2023. 11 were filmed during the golden hour between 6 and 7:30 p.m. 4 were filmed after full dark using dive lights or boat-mounted floods. 2 were filmed in early morning just after dawn. All of them show the same location. When I overlay the GPS coordinates from each video onto a single map, they cluster within a zone measuring 1.8 miles long and roughly 400 yards wide. That zone is the dead channel. The entity appears in 14 of the 17 videos. In the remaining 3, the camera captures only movement in the water, displaced wakes, disturbances in the mangrove roots, or sudden scattering of baitfish, but no clear visual of the source. The videos where the entity is visible range from 3 seconds to nearly 40 seconds of continuous footage. The longest clip was filmed by a night diver in August 2023, and I'll return to that one in detail later. For now, I want to establish what the footage consistently shows. The figure is bipedal. It moves upright through water that ranges from 3 to 6 feet deep, with a gait that suggests leg-driven propulsion rather than the undulating motion of a swimming human or dolphin. The speed is wrong for the depth. In multiple videos, the entity crosses 15 to 20 feet of frame in under 3 seconds while partially submerged, a pace that would require a human to sprint in waist-deep water, a physical impossibility without creating massive surface disturbance. The entity moves smoothly, leaving minimal wake. The body structure, where visible, appears humanoid but elongated. Shoulder width seems consistent with an adult human, but the torso is longer, and the limbs appear disproportionately extended. In 2 of the clearest videos, the entity turns briefly toward the camera, and the head shape is visible in silhouette. Oval, smooth, with no clear evidence of hair or external ears. Skin tone is difficult to determine due to lighting and water distortion, but in every video filmed during daylight, the entity appears dark, gray, deep brown, or mottled green-gray, possibly an effect of the tannin-stained water. In the night footage under artificial light, the skin reflects with a faint sheen that one diver described as like wet rubber, but organic. There is no audio of vocalizations. In 5 videos, the microphone picks up water displacement sounds, splashing, movement through roots, but nothing resembling speech, clicks, or whale-like calls. Silence is consistent. The entity does not approach the camera. In every case, it moves away or perpendicular to the observer, often slipping into deeper mangrove cover within seconds. The only exception is the March 14th paddleboard video, where the figure rises briefly into partial view before submerging. Even in that case, there's no indication of acknowledgement or curiosity. It appears, holds still for approximately 2 seconds, then leaves. I hired a movement analyst, someone who specializes in gait forensics for law enforcement, to review the footage. She studied the clips for 2 days before sending me her report. The conclusion was careful but unambiguous. The gait pattern is bipedal and consistent across multiple recordings, suggesting the same individual or species. The speed and smoothness of movement in shallow water are inconsistent with known human locomotion. The stride length, based on estimated distance covered and frame rate, suggests legs longer than average human proportions. I cannot identify this as any known animal. When I called to discuss her findings, I asked if she thought the footage could be faked. Individually, maybe, she said. But you're showing me 14 different videos, filmed by different people, on different dates, in different lighting conditions, all showing the same movement signature. To fake that would require coordination across years and access to the same physical location. It would also require someone with a very sophisticated understanding of non-human bipedal motion, because whoever or whatever this is doesn't move like a person in a suit. The mechanics are wrong for that. I asked what she meant. Humans in costume still move like humans, she said. The hip rotation, the weight transfer, the way the knees track, it's all still human under the surface. This doesn't track that way. The gait is too smooth, the leg extension is too long, and the acceleration is too quick. It looks like something that evolved to move through water bipedally, not something pretending to. The question, then, is not whether the footage is real. The question is what it shows. And the people who live closest to the dead channel have known the answer to that question for a very long time. They just have no intention of saying it out loud. The 17 videos exist because the people who filmed them were outsiders. Tourists on rental kayaks, charter clients from landlocked states, dive groups passing through on week-long trips. None of them knew they were entering water that locals had spent generations learning to avoid. And none of them understood until later that what they'd captured was something the community had collectively decided should not be captured at all. The footage breaks down into 3 categories based on the circumstances of the recording. The first category is incidental, cameras running for other reasons that happen to catch the entity in frame. The paddleboard video from March falls into this group, along with 5 others. The second category is reactive, recordings that began after the witness noticed something unusual in the water and grabbed their phone. 8 videos fit this pattern. The third category is the most unsettling, sustained observation. 3 videos show extended footage where the person filming clearly saw the entity early and continued recording as it moved through the frame, sometimes for 30 seconds or longer. I want to walk through the clearest examples from each category because the differences in how they were filmed reveal something important about how the entity behaves depending on whether it knows it's being watched. The first incidental capture that I was able to verify came from June 2021. A family from Atlanta had rented a pontoon boat and were filming their teenage daughter as she jumped off the bow into shallow water near the mangroves. The father was holding his phone in landscape mode, recording continuously as she climbed back onto the boat and prepared to jump again. The camera is steady, the framing is wide. You can see the daughter in the center of the frame, the boat's railing in the foreground, and roughly 40 feet of open water extending to the mangrove line in the background. At the 11-second mark, something rises partway out of the water on the far right side of the frame behind the daughter and roughly 25 feet from the boat. It's visible for less than 2 seconds. The shape breaks the surface smoothly. No splashing, no sudden burst upward, like a dolphin or tarpon. It simply rises until the top portion of what appears to be a head and shoulders clears the waterline, holds that position, then sinks back down in the same controlled way. The daughter doesn't see it. She's looking at the camera, smiling. The father doesn't see it either. He keeps recording for another 18 seconds, narrating encouragement as she jumps a second time. The video ends when he lowers the phone. He didn't notice what the camera had captured until 3 days later when the family was back in Atlanta reviewing vacation footage. He called the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to report what he thought might be an injured manatee. The dispatcher told him manatees don't surface vertically and suggested he may have filmed a dolphin or large fish. He sent the video to a marine biologist at a Georgia aquarium, who replied that the shape didn't match any known marine animal in the Keys and recommended he forward it to a cryptozoology researcher. He didn't do that. Instead, he posted it to YouTube with the title, "Something Weird in the Florida Keys?" The video received 43 views in 2 months, most of them likely from family members. It remained online, unlisted, and mostly forgotten until I contacted him in July 2023 after finding it through a keyword search for Florida Keys anomalies. When I interviewed him by phone, he was dismissive of the idea that he'd filmed anything significant. "I think it was probably just a reef shark or a big grouper," he said. "The water does weird things with light." I asked if he'd shown the video to anyone while he was still in the Keys. "Yeah, the guy at the marina where we returned the boat. He watched it and said he didn't see anything unusual." I asked if the marina operator had explained what he thought the shape was. "No, he just handed my phone back and said the water plays tricks sometimes. Then he asked if we'd had a good trip and started processing the return paperwork." The second incidental video came from a GoPro mounted on the bow of a fishing kayak in April 2022. The man who filmed it was a regular kayak fisherman from Tampa who had driven down for a long weekend specifically to fish the mangroves in the Keys. He set the GoPro to record continuously, a common practice for people who want hands-free documentation of their catches. The camera ran for 96 minutes. The entity appears at the 41-minute mark. The kayaker is paddling parallel to the mangrove line, moving slowly through a narrow channel. The water is calm, visibility is good. The GoPro's wide-angle lens captures nearly 180 degrees of view, showing the mangroves to the left, open water to the right, and the kayak's nose in the bottom center of the frame. The entity enters from the left. It moves across the frame from the mangroves toward deeper water, passing less than 10 feet in front of the kayak. The crossing takes approximately 4 seconds. During that time, the figure is fully visible from mid-torso up. The legs are submerged, but the movement makes clear they're providing propulsion. The arms are close to the body, not stroking or swimming. The head is in profile for roughly 2 seconds before the entity angles slightly away and submerges near the far edge of the frame. The kayaker didn't notice it. His attention was on a fishing rod in his hands. He was actively working a lure, facing slightly right, away from where the entity passed. The GoPro captured what he missed. He discovered the footage 2 weeks later while editing together a fishing highlights video. His first reaction, according to what he told me, was to assume he'd paddled past another kayaker or a waiting fisherman. But when he reviewed the clip in slow motion, the proportions didn't resolve into anything familiar. He posted a 15-second excerpt to a fishing forum with the caption, "Can anyone tell me what I paddled past?" The thread received 64 replies in 3 days. Most of them were jokes, suggestions that he'd encountered a manatee, a diver, or Aquaman. A few were serious attempts at identification, maybe a dolphin, maybe a tarpon rolling near the surface, maybe a trick of light and shadow. One reply, posted from an account with a Florida Keys location tag, said only, "Where was this?" The kayaker replied with the general area near Duck Key, but didn't provide specific coordinates. The user with the Keys location didn't respond again, but the kayaker told me that within an hour of posting that information, his thread was locked by a forum moderator with the explanation, "Off-topic discussion." When he messaged the moderator to ask why a fishing video was considered off-topic in a fishing forum, he received no reply. He still has the full video file. When I asked if he'd ever returned to the same area, he said he had, twice. Both times he saw nothing unusual. He also mentioned, without prompting, that during his second trip, he'd stopped at a bait shop in Marathon to ask if anyone knew whether large dolphins frequented the channels near Duck Key. The person behind the counter, an older man he guessed was the owner, looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Dolphins don't come into the mangroves." The kayaker clarified that he'd seen something large moving through shallow water near the mangrove line. The shop owner's expression didn't change. "Maybe you saw a manatee." The kayaker said it moved too fast to be a manatee. The owner nodded slowly and said, "Water makes things look faster than they are." Then he turned his attention to another customer, and the kayaker understood the conversation was over. The reactive footage, videos that began only after the witness noticed something wrong, show a different pattern. In these cases, the entity is already in motion when the recording starts, and the framing is shaky, rushed, often poorly lit. But the behavior of the entity changes. It moves faster, it stays low in the water, and in 3 cases, it appears to deliberately use mangrove cover to break line of sight. The clearest reactive video was filmed in September 2022 by a woman who was stand-up paddleboarding at dusk. She had her phone in a waterproof pouch on her belt and pulled it out after noticing what she described as a person swimming in a really weird way, roughly 30 feet ahead of her. The video begins mid-motion. The camera is pointed at the water, bouncing with her paddle strokes as she tries to steady herself and zoom in at the same time. The entity is moving away from her, angling toward the mangroves. It's partially submerged with only the upper back and head visible above the waterline, The movement is fast, much faster than her paddling speed, and creates a V-shaped wake that she described as like a gator, but the shape was wrong. She calls out in the video, "Hey, are you okay?" There's no response. The figure continues moving, reaches the mangrove edge, and slips between two large root structures. She follows, paddling harder, and the camera swings wildly as she tries to navigate closer. When she reaches the spot where it disappeared, she stops and aims the phone at the dark water under the roots. Nothing. The water is still. She holds position for 18 seconds, scanning slowly, before the video ends. When I spoke to her in October 2023, she was reluctant to discuss the incident in detail. She confirmed she'd been alone, that the sun was setting, and that she'd assumed she was watching someone in distress. "I thought maybe they were cramping or drunk or something," she said. "The way they were moving just seemed off, like they were struggling. That's why I tried to help." I asked if she'd gotten a clear look at the figure. "Not really. It was dark and the water was murky. I just saw the shape and the way it moved. When it went under the roots, I thought maybe it would come up on the other side, but it didn't. I waited for a while and then I left." I asked if she'd reported it to anyone. "Yeah, I called the non-emergency line when I got back to shore, said I thought I'd seen someone swimming in the mangroves, and I was worried they might need help. The dispatcher asked for a location. I gave it to her. She said they'd send someone to check it out and thanked me for calling." I asked if she ever heard back. "No. I figured if they didn't call, it meant they didn't find anyone and there was nothing to worry about." She paused, then added, "I posted the video on Instagram that night. A couple people commented, asking what it was. I said I didn't know. The next morning, the video was gone. Instagram said it violated community guidelines, but they didn't say which ones." She tried to appeal the removal. The appeal was denied with no further explanation. She didn't re-upload it, but she kept the original file. When I asked why, she said, "Because I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't a person." The silence isn't accidental. It's not the result of ignorance, skepticism, or fear of ridicule. It's a deliberate, multi-generational practice maintained by a community that has made a collective decision not to speak about what lives in the dead channel. And the most telling evidence of that coordination is what happens when outsiders try to make them break it. I conducted 42 attempted interviews between May and September 2023. I spoke with charter captains, commercial fishermen, bait shop owners, marina operators, long-term residents, and retired Coast Guard personnel who had worked the Keys for decades. I showed the footage to 31 of them. The responses followed a pattern so consistent it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like rehearsal. The first reaction was always the same, a brief glance at the screen, rarely more than 5 seconds, before handing the phone back. No one watched the clips all the way through. No one asked to see them again. And no one asked follow-up questions about where or when they were filmed, despite the fact that those are the first questions any genuinely curious person would ask. The second reaction was dismissal. Manatee, dolphin, tarpon rolling, a diver, a swimmer. The explanations were delivered with total confidence, even in cases where the footage clearly showed something inconsistent with those identifications. When I pointed out the discrepancies, the bipedal movement, the speed, the body structure, the response was always some version of the same deflection. Water distorts things. Cameras make stuff look weird. People see what they want to see. The third reaction, and the most important, was the shutdown. Every interview ended the same way. The person would check their watch, remember an appointment, or suddenly have somewhere else to be. If I pushed, the tone shifted. Not to anger, but to something colder. A polite but immovable insistence that there was nothing more to discuss. One fishing guide in Islamorada let me buy him lunch in exchange for 20 minutes of his time. I showed him 3 videos on my phone while we sat in a dockside cafe. He looked at the first one for less than 3 seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. He didn't touch it again. "That's a manatee," he said. I told him manatees don't move bipedally or at that speed. He shrugged. "Looks like a manatee to me." I asked if he'd ever guided clients into the dead channel. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. He sat back slightly, putting another inch of distance between us. "I don't know what that is." I clarified that I was asking about a specific area northeast of Duck Key, and I offered to show him the coordinates. "I know the whole backcountry," he said. "There's no place called that." I explained that it was a local name, not an official one, and that other captains had confirmed they'd heard it. "Well, I haven't." He stood, dropping cash on the table for his half of the meal. "Thanks for lunch, but I've got a charter in 30 minutes. I checked later. He had no charters scheduled that day. The most detailed response I received came from a retired marine mechanic in his late 70s who had lived in Marathon for 53 years. I met him at his house after his daughter-in-law contacted me and said he'd agreed to speak off the record. He would not allow me to use his name, record audio, or film the conversation. I was permitted to take handwritten notes. He watched 2 of the videos all the way through, studying them closely before handing my phone back. "You want me to tell you what that is?" he asked. I said I wanted to know if he'd seen anything similar. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked me a question. "You know why people don't talk about this?" I said I assumed it was because they didn't want attention from researchers or media. He shook his head. "It's not about attention, it's about respect." I asked what he meant. "There are things that live in the ocean we don't have names for," he said, "and there are places those things go where they don't want to be bothered. The people who've been here long enough know that, and they know that the best way to make sure those things stay where they are and stay safe is to leave them alone, not to study them, not to film them, not to talk about them with people who don't understand why silence matters." I asked if he was saying the entity in the footage was real. I'm saying that whether it's real or not doesn't change what happens if too many people start looking for it. You bring enough cameras, enough boats, enough noise into a place that's been quiet for 100 years, and whatever was there stops being there. Either it leaves, or it gets hurt, or it gets killed. And the people here decided a long time ago that they weren't going to be responsible for that. I asked when that decision was made. He smiled faintly. "Long before I was born." I asked if his parents had talked about it. "My father told me 2 things when I was old enough to take a boat out alone. First, don't run the mangroves after dark unless you know the water like you know your own yard. Second, if you see something in the dead channel that doesn't make sense, you turn around and you don't tell anyone what you saw." He didn't explain why. He just made me promise. And I kept that promise for 50 years until you showed up here asking questions I'm probably stupid for answering. I asked why he agreed to talk to me at all. "Because it's already too late," he said. "You've got 17 videos. Other people have more. It's on the internet now. The silence is breaking whether we like it or not. So maybe the only thing left to do is make sure people understand why it was there in the first place." He walked me to the door and shook my hand. Before I left, he said one more thing. "If you're going to put this out there, you should know that the people here won't forgive you for it. They'll see it as a betrayal, and they'll be right." The pattern of deflection extends beyond individual interviews. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the National Park Service, and the Coast Guard for any reports, investigations, or documentation related to unidentified marine animals in the dead channel area. All 3 agencies responded that no such records existed. I then submitted a narrower request. Any incident reports, distress calls, or citizen contacts mentioning unusual sightings in the specific coordinates I provided. The FWC returned a single report from 2018. A tourist who called to report seeing a large, dark animal swimming upright near the mangroves. The report notes that an officer was dispatched to the location and found no evidence of any animal. The case was closed the same day with the notation, "Probable misidentification of dolphin or manatee." The National Park Service returned nothing. The Coast Guard returned 2 reports, both from 2022, both describing possible person in distress calls that resulted in searches of the area. In both cases, no person was found, and the incidents were classified as unfounded, with the explanation that the caller likely saw a swimmer or kayaker who left the area before rescuers arrived. I contacted the officer who filed the 2018 FWC report. He's still with the agency, now working in the Upper Keys. When I asked if he remembered the call, he said he didn't. I read him the details from the report he'd written. He listened, then said, "I respond to a lot of calls. Most of them are people who don't know what a manatee looks like." I asked if he recalled finding anything unusual when he searched the area. If I'd found something unusual, it would be in the report. I asked if anyone local had been present when he conducted the search. He paused before answering. "I don't remember." I pressed, asking if it was standard practice to search alone or if he typically coordinated with locals who knew the area. "It depends on the situation," he said. His tone had shifted, professional but colder. "Is there something specific you're trying to ask me?" I said I was trying to understand how thoroughly the area had been searched. "Thoroughly enough to close the case," he said. Then he told me he had another call coming in and ended the conversation. The most direct shutdown came from a charter captain in Duck Key who operates one of the oldest fishing services in the area. His family has been guiding in the Keys since the 1940s. I approached him at the marina, explained that I was researching the dead channel, and asked if he'd be willing to speak with me. He didn't ask what I wanted to know. He didn't ask to see the footage. He just looked at me for a long moment, then said, "No." I offered to pay for his time. I said no. I asked if he could recommend anyone else who might be willing to talk. "There's nobody." He turned and walked toward his boat. I followed, keeping a respectful distance, and tried once more. I said I understood people were protective of the area, but that the footage was already public and I was trying to document it responsibly. He stopped, didn't turn around, just stopped, his back to me for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he spoke without looking at me. "You want to do something responsible? Stop asking questions. Stop showing people that footage, and stop pretending you're helping by putting this on the internet. You're not documenting anything. You're ending something. And when it's gone, you'll make another video about how sad that is, and it won't bring it back." Then he stepped onto his boat and didn't speak to me again. That was in August. I haven't been back to Duck Key since. The pattern exists across generations, passed down quietly in families that have lived in the Keys long enough to remember when the islands were smaller and the channels ran deeper. It begins in childhood, always in childhood, and it follows the same trajectory: freedom, then encounter, then silence. Children in the Keys grow up amphibious. They swim before they walk with confidence, spend summers brown and salt-crusted, know the difference between a bonnethead and a blacktip by the time they're 7. The water isn't something to fear. It's an extension of home, as familiar as the houses built on stilts above the floodline. They paddle kayaks through the mangroves, dive for lobster in the shallows, fish off docks at dawn. The ocean raises them as much as their parents do, but somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12, some of them stop swimming in certain places, not everywhere. Just specific channels, specific mangrove cuts, specific stretches of water their families have fished for decades. They don't announce the decision. They don't explain it. They simply begin refusing to go into those areas, offering excuses that sound plausible enough that most parents don't push. The current's too strong, the bottom's too mucky, they don't feel like it today. The parents don't push because they remember doing the same thing when they were that age. I identified this pattern by accident. I was interviewing a woman in Islamorada about her husband's work as a fishing guide, trying to understand the local knowledge systems that get passed between generations of captains. She mentioned, in passing, that her son used to love snorkeling the mangroves, but had recently decided he preferred the reef instead. He was 11. I asked when he'd stopped going into the mangroves. She thought about it. Maybe 6 months ago. He just said he didn't think they were as interesting anymore, which was weird, because he used to beg us to take him out there every weekend. I asked if anything had happened that might have changed his mind. Not that I know of. He went out with his dad one Saturday morning in February, came back quiet, and after that, he just wasn't interested. She shrugged. Kids change their minds about stuff. I asked if her husband had noticed anything unusual that day. Her expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion, but something closer to caution. Why would you ask that? I backtracked, said I was just curious whether something specific had made the mangroves less appealing. Maybe he'd gotten spooked by a barracuda or a shark. She relaxed, but only partially. He didn't say, and his dad didn't mention anything either. I let it drop. But 2 weeks later, I spoke with a retired school teacher in Marathon who had taught elementary students in the Keys for 31 years. I asked her, in the context of a broader conversation about how local children related to the ocean, if she'd ever noticed students suddenly developing aversions to specific activities or locations. She didn't hesitate. All the time, usually around 4th or 5th grade. They'd be perfectly comfortable in the water, then one summer, they'd come back and refuse to swim in certain spots. If you asked them why, they'd say the water was too dirty or too deep or there were too many jellyfish. But it was always the same places, and it was always after they'd spent time there with family. I asked which places. She listed 3 areas. One of them was the Dead Channel, though she didn't use that name. She just described it. The mangrove channels northeast of Duck Key, where the water runs dark and the roots grow thick. I asked if she thought something was frightening them. She chose her words carefully. I think they saw something that made them understand they weren't supposed to be there. And I think their parents were relieved when they stopped going, even if nobody said that out loud. I pressed. Asked if she'd ever heard the children describe what they'd seen. No, they don't talk about it. Not to teachers, not to each other. That's the strange part. Usually kids that age can't keep secrets, but this one they keep. Over the next month, I documented 14 separate accounts from parents, teachers, and camp counselors describing the same phenomenon. The details varied slightly, but the structure was identical. A child who swam confidently in the backcountry suddenly refused to enter specific water. The refusal was quiet, not hysterical. No nightmares, no tantrums, just a firm and inexplicable boundary that appeared without warning and held without exception. In 9 of the 14 cases, the child had been in the Dead Channel area within 2 weeks of the behavioral change. I tried to interview the children themselves. Parents refused on their behalf in every case but 2. Both of those interviews were conducted with the parent present at the family's kitchen table, under the condition that I wouldn't use their names or identify them in any way. The first child was a 10-year-old girl who had stopped kayaking in the mangroves the previous summer. She was polite, articulate, and completely unwilling to discuss why. I asked if something had scared her. No. I asked if she'd seen an animal that made her uncomfortable. I just don't want to go there anymore. I asked if her friends still went into the mangroves. Some of them. I asked if she'd told them why she stopped. She looked at her mother, then back at me. There's nothing to tell. Her mother ended the interview shortly after that. As I was leaving, the girl said one more thing, unprompted. It's not scary, it's just private. I asked what she meant by private. She didn't answer. Her mother thanked me for my time and closed the door. The second child was a 12-year-old boy who had been spear fishing in the backcountry since he was 9. His father told me he'd been obsessed with it, going out every chance he got, bringing home yellowtail and mangrove snapper. He'd clean himself. Then, in April, he stopped. He still fished from the boat and off the docks, but he wouldn't go into the water with his spear gun anymore. I asked him why. "I don't need to." I asked if something had changed. He hesitated, looked at his father, then said, "I just figured out it's better to leave some things alone." I asked what things. Things that were there first. His father shifted in his seat but didn't interrupt. I asked the boy if he'd seen something that made him feel that way. "Yeah?" I asked if he could describe it. He shook his head. Not defiant, not scared, just certain. "I'm not supposed to." I asked who told him that. Nobody had to tell me. I just knew. The father ended the interview. He walked me outside, and as we stood beside my car, he said, "I know what you're trying to do, and I respect it. But you need to understand that what you're asking these kids to talk about isn't yours to take. It's theirs. They saw something. They made a decision about it. And that decision is part of growing up here. You don't get to put that on camera." I asked if he'd had the same experience when he was young. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went back inside. The only adult willing to describe their childhood encounter in detail was a woman in her early 60s who no longer lives in the Keys. She moved to Central Florida in her 20s and hasn't been back in decades. I reached her by phone after her sister, still a Keys resident, mentioned that she might be willing to talk, since she's far enough away now. She was hesitant at first, but after I explained the scope of the investigation, she agreed to describe what happened when she was 9 years old. It was July. I was out with my grandfather in his skiff. We were checking stone crab traps in the backcountry, and I was sitting in the bow watching the water. He was running slow because the tide was low and he didn't want to hit a root. I saw it come up maybe 20 feet ahead of us, off to the right. It stood up in the water, and I mean stood like a person stands, and it looked at the boat. Not at my grandfather, at me. I asked her to describe it. It had a face, I don't know how else to say that. Not a human face, but a face. Eyes that tracked. A mouth, I think, though I don't remember it opening. The skin was dark, smooth. It was taller than my grandfather, even though it was only showing from the waist up. And it didn't look surprised. It looked like it was deciding something. I asked what it decided. It sank back down, slow, controlled. Just lowered itself until the water covered it, and then it was gone. My grandfather didn't see it. He was looking down, messing with something in the boat. When I turned to tell him, he looked up and saw my face and said, "You saw one." Not a question, a statement. I nodded. He nodded back and said, "Then you know now." That was it. We finished pulling the traps and went home. He never brought it up again. And I never told anyone except my sister until right now. I asked if she'd been frightened. No, that's the thing people won't understand. I wasn't scared. I was acknowledged, like it saw me and it decided I was okay. And then it left. And I understood, even at 9, that I'd been trusted with something, so I kept the trust. I asked why she was willing to break it now. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Because I don't think it matters anymore. I think too many people have seen them now, and the silence isn't protecting them the way it used to. Maybe it never really did. Maybe we just told ourselves that so we'd feel better about keeping the secret." The Dead Channel's geography makes concealment possible in ways that seem almost engineered for something that doesn't want to be found. The zone measures approximately 1.8 miles in length, running roughly northeast to southwest, bordered on both sides by shallow flats that drain completely during spring low tides. But the channel itself holds water year-round, fed by a deep trench that cuts through the limestone substrate like a scar. The hydrologist I hired spent 3 days mapping the bathymetry using side-scan sonar and found depth variations that contradicted every navigation chart of the area. The published charts show consistent depths of 4 to 6 feet. The actual measurements revealed pockets reaching 18 feet, sometimes 20, carved into the bedrock in formations she described as almost cave-like. These depressions are invisible from the surface, hidden under dense mangrove canopy and stained water that blocks light penetration beyond the first few feet. She also identified what she called tidal trapping, a phenomenon where water flows into the channel during flood tide, but doesn't drain completely during ebb. The mangrove root structure creates enough resistance that the channel retains pools of standing water even when the surrounding flats are exposed. During certain lunar phases, these pools become temporarily isolated from the main tidal flow for periods of up to 3 hours, creating what is effectively a closed system. When I asked what could survive in that kind of environment, she walked me through the biological inventory. Prey base is substantial: juvenile snappers, mojara, mud minnows, shrimp, crabs. The mangrove roots harbor dense populations of small fish that could sustain a mid-level predator indefinitely. Dissolved oxygen levels remain adequate due to tidal exchange and photosynthesis from submerged vegetation. Water temperature stays relatively stable, warmer than open ocean, cooler than the exposed flats. If you were designing a refuge for something semi-aquatic that needed to avoid detection, she said, this would be a decent model, deep enough to hide, complex enough to evade pursuit, productive enough to sustain feeding, and isolated enough that human traffic stays minimal. She paused. But you'd also need a species with specific adaptations. It would have to tolerate brackish water, handle low visibility, navigate three-dimensional root structures, and cope with dramatic tidal fluctuations. That's a narrow ecological niche. I asked if any known species fit that profile. In the Keys, nothing large. You've got juvenile crocodiles occasionally, but they don't move the way your footage shows. River otters come through sometimes, but wrong body plan entirely. Manatees use the channels, but they're obligate surface breathers and they're not bipedal. She hesitated. Honestly, if I didn't know better, I'd say you're describing something that evolved specifically for this habitat. Something that's been here long enough to specialize. The mangrove system itself is old growth, red mangroves, with prop roots thick as telephone poles, some of them likely exceeding a century in age. Satellite imagery going back to the 1950s shows the same dense canopy, unchanged by hurricanes, that stripped vegetation from surrounding areas. The root matrix below the waterline forms a labyrinth complex enough that even experienced divers avoid it. I spoke with a technical diver who specializes in confined space navigation, and when I showed him underwater photos of the dead channel roots, he said flatly, "I wouldn't go in there." I asked why. "Too many entanglement hazards, visibility near zero, and if you get disoriented, you're not finding your way out. Those roots go down 15, maybe 20 feet in some places, twisting every direction. You lose your sense of up and down in there, you drown." I asked if something familiar with the structure could navigate it safely. If you knew it well enough? Maybe. You'd have to have spent years learning the roots, and you'd need to be comfortable in zero visibility, because even with a light, you're not seeing more than 2 feet in front of you. The water clarity, or lack of it, is the channel's most effective concealment feature. Tannins leached from decaying mangrove leaves stain the water the color of dark tea. Suspended sediment from tidal disturbance adds turbidity. Even at midday, even in shallow sections, you cannot see the bottom beyond arm's length. Anything submerged deeper than 3 feet becomes invisible from the surface. I tested this myself. I rented a kayak in September and paddled into the outer edge of the dead channel during low tide. The water was less than 4 feet deep. I could see my paddle blade when I dipped it in, but once it sank past 2 feet, it vanished completely. I dropped a white dive weight on a rope to gauge visibility. At 3 feet down, I lost sight of it. At 4 feet, I couldn't tell if it had reached the bottom or was still descending. If something wanted to remain unseen in that water, it would only need to stay low. And according to the footage, that's exactly what it does. 3 tourists have reported the same sequence of events. They captured clear footage of the entity, showed it to someone local, and within 24 hours discovered their files corrupted or missing. The pattern is specific enough that coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. The first case occurred in February 2023. A couple from Michigan filmed what they described as the clearest video anyone's gotten during a sunset kayak tour. The footage ran 47 seconds. They watched it together that evening at their hotel, confirmed it showed a bipedal figure moving through shallow water less than 15 feet from their kayak, and decided to ask the tour operator about it the next morning. They showed him the video on their phone. He watched without comment, handed the device back, and told them it was probably a manatee. They returned to their room to upload the file. The video was gone. The phone showed it in the camera roll, thumbnail intact, file size listed as 160 megabytes. But when they tried to play it, they received an error message. File corrupted or unsupported format. Every recovery app they attempted returned the same result. The second case came in May. A solo diver captured 18 seconds of footage showing the entity in profile, close enough that individual features were distinguishable. He surfaced, reviewed the clip on his dive computer screen, and returned to shore. He stopped at a marina to refill his tank and mentioned the footage to the attendant. The attendant asked to see it. The diver pulled the storage card, inserted it into his laptop, and found the file deleted. Not corrupted, gone entirely, as if it had never existed. The card's metadata showed no record of the video ever being written. The third case is the most disturbing because it involves deliberate physical intervention. A woman filmed 32 seconds from a rental boat in August. She showed the footage to her husband, then placed her phone in a dry bag and stowed it in the boat's console. When they returned to the dock, she asked the marina staff if they'd ever seen anything unusual in the backcountry. One of them asked where she'd been. She showed him the coordinates. He nodded slowly and asked if she'd seen anything interesting. She said she had, and reached for her phone to show him. The screen was shattered. The phone was still inside the sealed dry bag, which showed no signs of external damage, but the screen had spider-webbed from a central impact point. The phone wouldn't power on. A repair technician later told her the damage was consistent with a precise strike to the storage chip location, enough force to destroy the component without cracking the bag. She still has the phone. I examined it. The technician's assessment was correct. The impact fractured only the storage assembly, leaving the battery, logic board, and screen connector intact until the screen damage propagated from the internal fracture point. It looked less like an accident and more like someone knew exactly where to apply pressure. None of these individuals filed police reports. All of them left the Keys within 48 hours and have not returned. The theory that the locals aren't hiding a threat, but honoring an agreement, emerged from conversations with the oldest residents, those who remember stories their grandparents told about hurricanes in the 30s and 40s, when survival in the Keys often came down to decisions that couldn't be explained later without sounding like superstition. The stories share a structure: boats that should have sunk but didn't, families that sheltered in places that shouldn't have held, fishermen who found their way home through storm surge in total darkness. And in almost every account, there's a gap in the narrative where the explanation should be. Just gratitude directed at something unnamed and a stated obligation to leave certain waters alone. A man in his 80s told me his grandmother described the hurricane of 1935 as when we learned the bargain. The storm killed over 400 people, but their family survived in a mangrove channel when their house was obliterated. His grandmother never explained how they knew to go there or what guided them through water, moving too fast to navigate by memory. She only said they were shown the way, and that afterward they understood certain boundaries weren't theirs to cross. When he asked who showed them, she replied, "What was there first?" Early footage from 2021 and 2022 shows the entity surfacing fully, holding position for seconds at a time, moving without apparent urgency. The March 2023 paddleboard video captures it rising between mangrove roots in clear view, not hiding, not rushing. But recordings from late 2023 show different behavior. The entity stays submerged longer, surfaces only partially, and moves with what the movement analyst described as evasive patterning. In the most recent clip from November, filmed by a dive group, the figure appears for less than 2 seconds before retreating into root structure so quickly the camera loses track entirely. The locals have noticed. Their silence, once protective, now carries something closer to grief. 3 longtime residents broke pattern in October and spoke to me with resigned clarity. One said, "It's learning we're dangerous." Another, "We kept the secret as long as we could." The third simply, "It's already gone." The question isn't whether the footage is real. Forensic analysis confirms it. The question is what happens now that exposure has become inevitable. The locals understood something that outsiders didn't. Some things survive only by remaining unproven. Their silence wasn't ignorance. It was a choice made generations ago to protect what was there first. That protection is failing now, not because the community broke, but because cameras are everywhere and secrets don't hold the way they used to. What lives in the dead channel is learning what the locals already knew, that being seen means being endangered, and the only defense left is disappearance.